A structure that has stood for what we thought was 4,500 years just had its birth certificate challenged by 20,000 years. Not a rounding error, not a rival theory with a slightly different pharaoh or a slightly different decade. 20,000 years, which would place the first stone of the Great Pyramid before agriculture, before pottery, before permanent villages, before the wheel, in an era when much of Europe was still buried under ice sheets. And the strange part is that the person making this claim is not a fringe writer chasing ancient aliens. He is a working engineer, and the tool he used is something you can actually go and look at yourself, because it isn't hidden in a chamber or encoded in a myth. It's sitting in the erosion on the stone. For more than a century, the timeline of the Great Pyramid has rested on 4 separate pillars of evidence, and each one arrived decades apart, built by different people who were not trying to prove each other right. The first came in 1837, when a British colonel named Howard Vyse used gunpowder to force his way into a set of low-relieving chambers stacked above the king's chamber, spaces that had been sealed since the pyramid was built. Inside, painted in red ochre on blocks no living person had seen, were quarry marks and a worker's graffiti, including a cartouche naming Khufu. That single piece of evidence became controversial decades later when the author, Zecharia Sitchin, argued in the 1980s that Vyse had faked the marks to please his patrons. Egyptologists examined the claim and rejected it, pointing out that the marks matched the handwriting conventions, pigments, and internal consistency of genuine Old Kingdom quarry gangs, and that no physical evidence of forgery has ever surfaced. Still, a single inscription is a thin foundation for a civilization's timeline, so it's worth asking what else supports the conventional date, because the answer turns out to be substantial. Through the 1990s, the archaeologist Mark Lehner led excavations south of the Giza Plateau that uncovered an entire settlement built to house and feed the pyramid's labor force. Bakeries capable of mass-producing bread, sleeping quarters organized like barracks, and enormous quantities of cattle, sheep, and fishbone all pointed to a highly organized, state-fed workforce operating on an industrial scale. Not slaves, as popular myth would have it, but a rotating labor system supported by the full machinery of a functioning kingdom. Then, in 2013, a French archaeological team led by Pierre Tallet made a discovery that turned out to be one of the most important finds in Egyptology in decades. At Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast, they recovered a set of papyri, the oldest inscribed papyri ever found, written by a mid-level official named Merer. His logbook records, in his own hand, the daily work of ferrying white limestone from the quarries at Tura across the Nile to a site he calls Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, during what he explicitly dates as year 27 of Khufu's reign. This is not a monument inscription commissioned to glorify a king. It is a bureaucrat's shipping log, the kind of document nobody fakes for propaganda, and it places real people moving real stone toward the pyramid at a specific point in a specific reign. Radiocarbon dating adds a 4th line of evidence, and it comes with an honest complication worth mentioning. Surveys conducted in 1984 and again in 1995 extracted organic material, mostly charcoal, and plant remains embedded in the pyramid's mortar, and dated it using carbon-14 decay. The results clustered in a range consistent with construction in the 26th century BC, broadly matching the historical chronology, though running a few centuries older on average than expected. Lehner and his colleagues attribute that gap to what's known as the old wood problem, since builders often burned acacia and tamarisk that had been dead for a long time before it was used as fuel, which skews radiocarbon results older than the actual construction date. That's a debate about a few hundred years. It is nowhere close to the scale of the claim now being discussed, and that gap in scale is exactly what makes this new theory worth examining carefully rather than dismissing outright. It's worth pausing on just how unusual it is for 4 independent lines of evidence, developed by different researchers using completely different methods across more than 150 years, to converge on roughly the same window of time. Vyse wasn't trying to confirm Lehner's future excavations. Tallet wasn't trying to validate radiocarbon results from the 1990s. Each of these findings stands on its own, discovered for its own reasons, and yet they all point toward the same reign, the same century, the same king. That kind of convergence is exactly what gives archaeologists confidence in a historical timeline, because it isn't resting on a single fragile thread that could snap under one bad reinterpretation. It's resting on a rope made of several independent strands, which is precisely why any theory proposing to override all of it faces such a steep climb. This isn't the first time erosion on the Giza Plateau has been used to argue for a much older date either. In the early 1990s, the geologist Robert Schoch argued that the vertical weathering patterns on the enclosure walls of the Great Sphinx looked like water erosion rather than wind and sand erosion, and he proposed that this pointed to a period of heavier rainfall going back to before 5000 BC, thousands of years before the conventional 4th dynasty date for the Sphinx, Schoch's water erosion hypothesis triggered a similar reaction to what we're seeing now with Donini's report, some interest from geologists willing to consider the physical argument on its own terms, and firm pushback from Egyptologists who pointed to construction techniques, quarry marks, and the broader archaeological context tying the Sphinx enclosure to the same era as the pyramids around it. That debate has continued for more than 3 decades without resolving in Schoch's favor within mainstream Egyptology, and it's a useful precedent here, because it shows that erosion-based redating claims at Giza have a track record of generating headlines that outpace the underlying certainty of the evidence. The new claim comes from Alberto Donini, an Italian engineer affiliated with the University of Bologna, who released a preliminary non-peer-reviewed report in January 2026 through open academic repositories. Donini's method, which he calls the relative erosion method, or REM, does not rely on carbon dating, inscriptions, or historical texts at all. Instead, it treats the stone itself as a kind of clock, based on a genuinely clever observation about the pyramid's own history. For most of its existence, the Great Pyramid was covered in a smooth outer casing of polished white Tura limestone, the same fine-grained stone used in the finishing work described in Merer's logbook. The casing protected the underlying core structure and its base pavement from direct exposure to wind, sand, and rain for thousands of years. In 1303 AD, a major earthquake struck the region and loosened large sections of that casing. Over the following century, builders in Cairo systematically stripped the remaining casing stones to use as construction material for mosques, bridges, and fortifications, a well-documented practice in medieval Cairo's architectural history. By Donini's calculation, that leaves the newly exposed surfaces having weathered in the open air for roughly 675 years, counting backward from the present. Here is where the method becomes genuinely interesting rather than just speculative. At the base of the pyramid, some sections of the original limestone pavement survive in a configuration where one part of a slab sat protected under the casing for millennia, while an adjacent part of that same slab, cut from the same stone at the same time, has been exposed to the open air since the day it was laid. That is an unusually clean natural experiment. 2 surfaces, identical composition, identical location, different exposure histories, one of which has a documented start date. Donini reasoned that if you measure how deep or how extensive the erosion is on the 675-year-old surface, and then measure the erosion on the surface that has supposedly been exposed since construction, the ratio between those 2 measurements should tell you, assuming erosion proceeds at a roughly constant rate, how long the older surface has actually been weathering. Scale up from a known interval to an unknown one, and you get an estimated construction date without needing a single artifact, inscription, or organic sample. Donini selected 12 measurement points around the base of the Great Pyramid, along with additional points on the Pyramid of Khafra and 2 of the smaller Queen's Pyramids nearby. And at each location, he measured either the depth of pitting erosion or the volume of material lost from the stone. Applying his ratio calculation across those 12 points on the Great Pyramid produced a wide spread of individual results, ranging from roughly 5,700 years of exposure at one location to more than 54,000 years at another. When he averaged all 12 values together, the mean came out to approximately 24,900 years before the present, which converts to a construction date of roughly 22,900 BC, essentially 20,000 years earlier than the accepted 4th Dynasty date of around 2560 BC. Donini went further and built a basic statistical model around that average, calculating a standard deviation and constructing a Gaussian probability curve, which he uses to state that there is roughly a 68% probability the true exposure time falls somewhere between about 11,000 and 39,000 years, an enormous range that he acknowledges in the report itself. To his credit, Donini does not present this as a settled fact, and it's worth being precise about what he actually claims versus what headlines have compressed it into. He explicitly states that REM is not designed to produce an exact date, only an order of magnitude estimate, and he describes his own results as indicative rather than conclusive, citing what he calls several unquantifiable factors that could have altered erosion rates over time. He also floats a specific historical interpretation to reconcile his numbers with the existence of Khufu's name inside the structure, suggesting that Khufu may not have built the pyramid at all, but rather renovated and rededicated an already ancient monument, claiming authorship the way later pharaohs sometimes did with older structures. That is a speculative addition layered on top of an already speculative method, and it's important to flag it as such rather than let it pass as an established conclusion. Donini closes his report by inviting archaeologists and geologists to test and refine REM collaboratively, which is a notably different posture than most claims of this scale usually take. So why hasn't a paper this dramatic upended Egyptology overnight? The honest answer is that the scientific case for taking REM seriously and the scientific case for doubting its conclusions are both real, and they exist side by side. On the side favoring serious consideration, this is a genuinely original idea. Most challenges to the pyramid's age lean on mythology, numerology, or claims about lost civilizations with no physical test attached to them. REM is different because it proposes a measurable, repeatable physical technique, and it identifies a real natural experiment, matched stone with two different exposure histories and one known interval. That is not nothing. New dating methods are rare, and the history of science shows that dismissing a testable idea purely because it's inconvenient is usually a mistake. But the problems start as soon as you ask whether erosion actually behaves the way REM assumes it does. The entire calculation depends on the idea that limestone wears away at a roughly constant linear rate over time, and that assumption runs into trouble almost immediately. Anyone who has walked through an old cemetery has seen this firsthand. Headstones from the 1700s can still be crisp and legible, while nearby stones from a century later have weathered into smooth, illegible blanks because stone doesn't erode like a dripping tap. It often sits protected by a hardened surface crust for long stretches. Then that crust fails, and erosion accelerates rapidly. A model built on a constant rate will misread that kind of threshold behavior every time, and the type of limestone used at Giza is exactly the sort of soft, porous, sedimentary rock known to behave this way. Layered on top of that is the climate problem, which may be the single hardest obstacle for REM to overcome. If Donnini's estimate is even roughly correct, the pyramid's oldest exposed surfaces would have been weathering since somewhere around the peak of the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 to 26,000 years ago, when the region's climate looked nothing like it does today. Then, between roughly 9,000 and 5,000 BC, North Africa experienced what's known as the African humid period, when the Sahara held lakes, rivers, grasslands, and wildlife before drying back into desert. Each of those massive climate swings would have changed rainfall, humidity, groundwater salinity, and wind patterns, all of which directly affect how fast limestone dissolves in pits. A method that treats erosion as a steady, unchanging clock across the most dramatic climate shifts of the last 100,000 years is trying to read time with an instrument that keeps changing its own speed. It's also worth remembering just how much has happened to the Giza Plateau in the 20th and 21st centuries alone, all of which sits directly on top of whatever ancient weathering signal REM is trying to isolate. Cairo has grown from a modest city into a metropolis of more than 20 million people pressed right up against the plateau, bringing with it decades of vehicle emissions, industrial pollution, and acidic rainfall that didn't exist in anything like the same concentration a century ago. Add to that the site's status as one of the most visited archaeological locations on the planet, drawing millions of tourists annually who walk, touch, and lean on exactly the kind of low pavement blocks Donnini measured, and you have a surface whose modern history is anything but quiet. None of this proves REM is wrong, but it does mean that isolating a clean, ancient erosion signal from a surface with this much recent disturbance is an enormously difficult technical problem, one that Donnini's report doesn't fully resolve. There's also the problem of the stone itself. Limestone blocks quarried meters apart can differ in fossil content, porosity, and hardness, and a softer block will always look more eroded than a harder one nearby, regardless of how long either has been exposed, which means depth of erosion can reflect the character of the rock as easily as it reflects the passage of time. On top of that, the pavement Donnini measured has not been sitting untouched in a controlled environment. It has been buried and re-exposed by shifting sand more than once, walked across by millions of tourists over the past 2 centuries, subjected to modern pollution and acid rain, and repeatedly cleaned or restored by site conservators. Separating natural weathering from all of that recent human interference on a surface this heavily visited is extraordinarily difficult, and Donnini himself acknowledges wear from tourism and restoration as complicating factors in his own report. Then there's the internal consistency of the data, and this is where the numbers argue against themselves. 12 measurement points producing results from 5,700 years up to more than 54,000 years is not a tight cluster with a clear signal. It's closer to a spread you'd expect if the method were picking up variation in stone hardness, local weathering conditions, and modern disturbance rather than a clean, uniform signal of age. Averaging a scatter that wide tells you a number exists, but it doesn't tell you the number means what you want it to mean. And a probability band, stretching from roughly 11,000 to 39,000 years before present, reflects genuine uncertainty, not fine-grained precision. Every established dating method in use today had to pass a specific test before archaeologists trusted it, and that test is calibration, meaning the method has to be applied to structures or objects whose age is already known through independent evidence, with its predictions checked against that known answer before anyone accepts its verdict on something genuinely uncertain. When Willard Libby introduced radiocarbon dating in the late 1940s, it faced exactly this kind of skepticism, and it earned its place in archaeology only after it was tested, repeatedly against artifacts of known age, and kept returning correct results. Dendrochronology and thermoluminescence went through the same process. Riem has not yet been through that gate. Donini has not published results applying his method to a Roman temple with an inscribed dedication date, a medieval cathedral with detailed construction records, or an Egyptian monument independently pinned to a specific reign through inscriptions, and until that calibration step happens, there is no way to know whether Rem is actually measuring the passage of time or simply measuring differences in how various stone surfaces happen to weather, which are two very different things that can look identical in the data. Even a fully calibrated version of Rem would still have to explain everything the conventional evidence already accounts for. It would need to explain how a quarry inspector named Merer could write a shipping log naming Akhet Khufu and dating his own work to year 27 of Khufu's reign, if the structure had already existed for 20,000 years before that reign began. It would need to explain a fully staffed workers' settlement, complete with bakeries and organized food supply chains, built specifically to support pyramid construction during the 4th dynasty. It would need to explain radiocarbon dates from the pyramid's own mortar clustering around the 26th century BC rather than scattering across 20 millennia. A theory that overturns a well-supported timeline doesn't just need new evidence pointing somewhere else. It needs to account for all of the old evidence too, and right now that reconciliation hasn't been attempted in any rigorous way. As of now, no major peer-reviewed archaeological or geological rebuttal has been published in response to Donini's report, largely because the report itself is only weeks old and has not been submitted through a formal peer review process. What has happened is a fairly predictable pattern among archaeologists and geologists who have commented publicly, and it isn't outright dismissal. Most describe the underlying idea as creative and worth investigating, while raising the same core objections around linearity, climate variability, and the total absence of calibration against known age structures. That's roughly the same reception radiocarbon dating received in its first few years, before Libby's calibration tests convinced skeptics that the numbers could be trusted. The difference is that Libby ran those tests. Donini, so far, has not. It's also worth thinking through what a 22,900 BC construction date would actually require of the people who supposedly built it, because the implications go far beyond just moving a number on a timeline. The Great Pyramid originally stood about 146 meters tall, built from roughly 2.3 million limestone blocks averaging over 2 tons apiece, arranged with a base so precisely leveled that it varies by only a few centimeters across more than 200 meters, and aligned to true north with an accuracy that many modern buildings don't match. Producing that level of precision requires organized labor on a massive scale, standardized measurement systems, logistics capable of moving millions of tons of stone, and almost certainly some form of writing or record keeping to coordinate it all. Archaeology has found no trace of any civilization anywhere on Earth at that technological level 20,000 years ago. No cities, no evidence of large-scale organized labor, no writing systems, nothing resembling the infrastructure that produced the pyramid we see today. That absence doesn't disprove Donini's dating outright, but it does mean the claim isn't just asking us to move a construction date. It's asking us to accept that an entire unknown civilization existed with no other trace anywhere in the archaeological or genetic record, which is an extraordinarily heavy burden of proof for a preliminary, non-peer-reviewed erosion measurement to carry on its own. None of this means the question is closed forever, and it would be a mistake to treat healthy scientific caution as the same thing as institutional stubbornness. If Donini or independent research teams take REM to structures with firmly established construction dates, measure them blind, and the method consistently returns the correct answer across multiple independent trials, it would earn a legitimate place in the archaeological toolkit, and its reading of the Giza Plateau would deserve to be taken far more seriously than it currently can be. That is exactly the path every trusted dating method in use today had to walk, and there's no reason REM should be exempt from it. Until that happens, though, the responsible position is neither blind acceptance nor reflexive mockery. It's simply recognizing the difference between an intriguing hypothesis and a demonstrated fact, and being honest with yourself about which one you're looking at. It's also worth being clear about what mainstream Egyptology is actually built on, because it's often caricatured online as blind faith in old textbooks that nobody has questioned in decades. In reality, the Old Kingdom dating for Giza has been repeatedly stress-tested using entirely independent methods over the past several decades, from settlement archaeology and papyrological discoveries to isotope chemistry. And it keeps holding up under scrutiny rather than needing to be propped up by tradition alone. That doesn't make the field infallible or immune to revision. Egyptology has changed its mind on plenty of details over the last century, from construction techniques to the size and composition of the labor force to the interpretation of specific inscriptions. But changing a detail within an established framework is very different from discarding the entire framework based on a single uncalibrated measurement technique. And conflating the two is where a lot of the online discourse around claims like this one goes wrong. What makes this story worth paying attention to isn't really whether Donini turns out to be right. It's a reminder of how dating actually works, and how much evidence has to line up before we're willing to say we know something about the deep past. The Great Pyramid spent most of its existence wrapped in a shell of polished stone that gave nothing away, and every generation that has come along since has read its age using the best tool available to them at the time: painted quarry marks, a boatman's discarded logbook, radiocarbon isotopes trapped in ancient mortar, and now, potentially, the microscopic pitting on a slab of limestone. Some of those tools have held up under scrutiny. Others, like this one, are still waiting for their first real test. The pyramid isn't going anywhere while we figure out which is which, and neither is the truth about who built it and when. If you found this breakdown useful, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next deep dive, and drop a comment below with your own take. Do you think REM deserves a serious calibration test, or is this destined to join the long list of pyramid theories that never made it past the headline stage? Hit the like button if you want more videos that dig into the actual science behind these claims instead of just repeating the hype, and share this with anyone you know who loves a good ancient mystery backed by real evidence. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.